Aloha everyone, and welcome to today's lecture on Chapter 22, which is all about ecosystem ecology. As you remember, we began in Chapter 20 by looking at population ecology, and we talked about the example of Isle Royale. Then we moved into Chapter 21, talking about community ecology and the problem with losing a lot of our bees. Now we are going to move to the next step and learn about ecosystem ecology. And the textbook uses an example of bison in Montana as the example for ecosystem ecology. So let's go ahead and get started. In this lecture, we have 3 learning outcomes. The first is to learn what exactly are ecosystems and how do keystone species, which we talked about last chapter, affect ecosystems. Secondly, we're going to look at how do nutrients, water, and energy move through ecosystems. So we're going to be looking at 3 nutrient cycles. We'll be looking at how energy moves through the energy pyramid, and we'll also talk about the water cycle. And then finally, we're going to look at how biomes are characterized, and we'll see the most common biomes that we have in our various ecosystems. As I mentioned, Chapter 22 uses bison as an example for talking about ecosystems, and it focuses on the prairie grass ecosystem. Once upon a time, there were a lot more bison than there are today. There were once over 30 million bison in North America. So you can see that here in this figure. This shows you the year down on the bottom, ranging from 1500 to 1990. And then on the y-axis here is the bison population. So we had, this one says approximately 45 million. Your textbook says 30 million bison. By the late 1800s though, they had been hunted down to under 500 individuals. So you can see down here, the species nearly went extinct in 1884. It's estimated there were only 325 bison that were still in existence. Part of the problem with this is that in the 1870s, hunting for bison actually became a sport. In this sport, people from the eastern coast would come out to experience the Wild West, and to do that, they would hunt bison. Luckily for bison, the federal government identified them as an endangered species, and that allowed the species to repopulate. So you can see that, how we were down in these low numbers, and then the species started to repopulate. By the 1990s, bison not privately owned, their numbers were around 25,000, which was, again, a significant increase from being down here at 325 back in 1884. Due to conservation efforts, when we add up all the bison together, there are now over 500,000 bison, but most of these bison are on privately owned ranches, so about 90% of them are found on ranches instead of just being wild, free, roaming bison. Here you see a picture from your text showing all of these bison skulls. So you can see we were just hunting them way too rapidly, causing those numbers to decline. The APR, which is the American Prairie Reserve, is what we term a rewilding effort to restore 3.2 million acres of land, and they want to place about 10,000 bison on it. So when I say rewilding effort, what I mean is it is trying to restore native wildlife to their original habitat. So what the APR does is they try to buy up land. The APR consists of public land as well as land that is purchased by private donors. If completed, the APR would have the largest bison herd in the world. This sounds like a really great thing, right? So you can see in this map in green, These are areas owned by the American Prairie Reserve. And to the APR's credit, something that they do is they actually go in and they try to buy the land. They don't just try to take over land, which would obviously be a wrong way to go about it. But the reason why there is some resistance with this, which we'll talk more about at the end of the lecture, is that this area is also a really great place for cattle because that area is all prairies, which prairies, as we will learn, are where bison like to live. That's also where cattle like to live. Cattle do not wallow in the grass or roam wildly. Wallowing is when larger animals will kind of throw themselves on the ground and scratch their back to try to get rid of loose hair or to get things off of them, sometimes flies, other things that are bothering them. And they kind of make these little shallow divots in the ground that can allow water to collect. So really, they don't have the same positive influence for the ecosystem as we see with bison, but it's still a great place for cattle to live. And APR is really controversial, especially for ranchers who think of it as a challenge to their way of life, which I think we can all relate to in a way. If somebody was to tell you that the land that your home is on, they would like to buy that to do something completely different with that land, you would kind of feel not okay with that, right? And that's how a lot of these ranchers are feeling. And like I said, we'll talk more about that at the end of the lecture. So this chapter is all about ecosystem ecology, which begs the question, what exactly is an ecosystem and how is that different from a population or a community? So if you remember, a population is one single species, right? So we're just talking about wolves or moose of a particular species. A community, as we learned in the last chapter, is all the different living organisms or the different populations living together in an area. So that would be the bees and the mites that might be parasites on the bees and the flowers that the bees are pollinating. That constitutes a community. What makes an ecosystem different is that now we're not just looking at living things. With an ecosystem, it includes all the living as well as the non-living things and processes occurring in an area. So here we're not just looking at biotic things or living things, we're also looking at abiotic or non-living things. So an ecosystem includes the community of living things in a particular location and the non-living environment in which those organisms are interacting in a particular location. So features of the non-living environment that influence ecosystem is going to be things like your physical conditions. So think temperature, the amount of precipitation, the amount of sunlight, and the different chemical resources or nutrients that are found in the soil. Water is another non-living thing that can influence an ecosystem, and also air. So you can see that kind of here. This is showing you the prairie ecosystem. So over here are all those non-living or abiotic factors. So we have temperature, rainfall, soil, the standing and flowing water. Like I said, these depressions that are caused by wallowing of the bison can actually contain water in them, and that can be really useful for, say, amphibians. Soil nutrients, air, so the amount of carbon dioxide, the weather, light, fire, grazing, burrow, and like I said, those wallowing depressions. So all those things are non-living parts of that ecosystem. When it comes to the living portion of an ecosystem, you can see it's all the different plants, right? So grasses, shrubs, flowering plants. Then we have non-burrowing mammals, burrowing mammals, bird species, reptiles, amphibians, insects. So all of those living components as well. So again, just a reminder, your ecosystem contains living and non-living things together. So this ecosystem here would be the North American prairie, and it has an abundance of grasses and a variety of animals, and bison once thrived in this ecosystem. And that's why efforts like those by APR are trying to restore bison to the American prairie. But just keep in mind, the American prairie ecosystem not only includes these organisms, it includes all of these non-living or abiotic factors as well. We talked about last chapter how we have what we term keystone species. And keystone species are species that play a fundamental role in supporting an entire ecosystem, or an entire community is what we talked about last chapter. But a keystone species in the prairie ecosystem would be bison. So keystone species are not necessarily the most abundant species in an ecosystem, but if they are lost, that can have a really huge impact on the ecosystem. So bison are considered a keystone species because they graze. And by them grazing on grass, they preferentially eat the grass compared to other types of vegetation. That promotes the growth of other plants, or plants other than grass. So bison grazing and also their wallowing promotes habitat for a wide variety of animal species. So as I mentioned, that wallowing is where the bison are going to lay down, kind of roll over in the grass. They're going to scratch their back, try to remove the loose fur that may be on them, try to get rid of flies, other insects that might be bothering them. And then that creates those little shallow depressions that can collect water when it rains, and that can be a great place for like amphibians to live. They otherwise wouldn't be able to live there because they need that wet moisture. They can't live without that water. So the presence of bison as a keystone species, what this does is it supports a diversity of species in an ecosystem. Just as a keystone supports the weight of other stones in an arch. And your book has a nice picture of that where it shows that arch made out of stones, and you take that middle one at the top, which is bison, you take it out and everything collapses over, right? Same kind of thing. If you remove a keystone species, it can wreak havoc on an entire ecosystem. And last lecture, we talked about this in regards to sharks and other large apex predators, right? If we compare the number of them around the main Hawaiian Islands versus the northwestern Hawaiian Islands, we see very different communities because we need those large apex predators to be there to have an increase of diversity. Same thing here with the bison. Without bison, grass overgrows and it crowds out the other plant species that could be there. Also, many animal species lose their habitat and become less common. So the loss of a keystone species devastates the entire ecosystem. Just as, like I said, taking that keystone, that middle stone from an arch, that can cause that whole arch to collapse. Bison are also what we term ecosystem engineers. So these are keystone species that alter habitat for other species. And the most well-known example of an ecosystem engineer would be the beaver, right? Beavers take logs, they cut them all down, they build the dams in the creeks, and by doing that, they divert the water flow and they create wetlands, they create ponds, that creates more habitat. So what happens with these ecosystem engineers is that they increase biodiversity. And bison actually engineer the prairie to increase biodiversity. Biodiversity is a word I've used a few times, so I thought I'd formally define it for you. Biodiversity is simply the number of species living in a certain area. And we want to increase biodiversity, right? We don't just want one or two types of species. We want a lot of different species all living in harmony with one another within an ecosystem. So what happens is that bison are going to graze the grass, like I talked about. That keeps the grass from outcompeting and excluding other plants. They also, as I mentioned, wallow in the grass to get rid of those insects and shed their fur. That creates small holes in the ground that fill up with water and create habitat for frogs and other amphibians. Bisons also allow many species of plants, insects, birds, and mammals to all live together in the prairie ecosystem. So that again makes them not only a keystone species, but also an ecosystem engineer. Okay, so we made it through that first learning objective where I wanted to talk about what exactly is an ecosystem and how does the removal of keystone species affect your ecosystem. Next, we're going to move on to the second learning objective, which talks about the cycling of nutrients, energy, and water in ecosystems. Bison actually can have a profound effect on nutrient cycling in the American prairie ecosystem. So nutrients such as carbon, which is what this slide is about, and then we'll also talk about nitrogen and phosphorus, they're going to move into and out of the bodies of living organisms, and they move through the environment. So nutrients are going to be taken up, and they're actually incorporated into the molecules of living organisms. When organisms and their waste products then decompose, those nutrients are going to be returned to the environment, and these movements kind of make up a cycle for each nutrient. So in other words, we're recycling the nutrients. Carbon is used by primary producers. So again, those are at the bottom of the food chain, and they're going to manufacture organic molecules via the process of photosynthesis. Those carbon compounds are then manufactured by both primary producers and consumers. And carbon dioxide, as you know, every time you take a breath out, you're releasing carbon dioxide. So it's eventually released from all organisms through respiration and also during the process of decomposition. So you can see that here in this figure, right? We have carbon dioxide coming from the atmosphere. You have that carbon dioxide is going to be incorporated by primary producers through the process of photosynthesis. It's then going to be taken up by consumers, and then when those consumers die, it's going to get decomposed, and that decomposition then leads right back to create that cycle again, right? So again, it's a cycle of nutrients. So in photosynthesis, those primary producers convert carbon dioxide into organic matter. That is then passed to animals and other consumers in the food chain. Both producers and consumers are going to release carbon dioxide as a product of respiration, just like we as humans do. And the rest of that carbon is going to be fixed by autotrophs, which are primary producers, right? Auto, making their own food. And it's eventually going to be excreted as waste or ends up in the form of dead bodies. This non-living organic matter is going to form what we term detritus, which is kind of this dead material, and dissolved organic matter, which you may have heard before, the acronym DOM. That means dissolved organic matter. So bacteria and other decomposers are going to break down all this organic matter that releases carbon dioxide. And when it releases that carbon dioxide, we start that cycle all over again. Next, we're going to look at the nitrogen cycle. So nitrogen gas from the atmosphere is going to be converted by cyanobacteria and other bacteria into a usable form of nitrogen. And this is done by the process of nitrogen fixation. So the reason for this is that nitrogen gas really can't be used by most organisms. We have to have it converted via the process of nitrogen fixation. Otherwise, it can't be used by organisms. So you can see that nitrogen gas here, nitrogen fixation takes place, and now it is fixed nitrogen. Primary producers are going to take up this usable nitrogen to produce organic matter. That nitrogen is then passed on to animals and other types of consumers when they eat the organic matter. Usable nitrogen then can be excreted as waste by producers and consumers, or it can be regenerated by decomposing bacteria. Nitrogen, you may be wondering, why do we care that much about nitrogen? Well, nitrogen is a critical component of proteins, RNA, and DNA. So in other words, as living organisms, we need those things, right? The nitrogen atoms are going to cycle between different chemical compounds as they move from organism to soil, to the water, to the air, and back to the organisms. So here is kind of a marine example of that. You'll notice I bring a lot of marine examples into this because We are surrounded by the ocean. Also, you have the example in your book, right, where it talks about this fixed nitrogen goes into the plants, that then goes into the animals. Then you have that waste that comes out that's going to be fixed back into nitrogen. You also have that animal is going to die, have to decompose. Nitrogen cycles throughout the ecosystem just like carbon does. Another really important nutrient in ecosystems is phosphorus. So primary producers are going to incorporate or put in phosphate into organic matter, which is then passed up the food chain, or it becomes detritus or dissolved organic matter. The phosphorus in organisms and detritus is going to be deposited into the sediment, and then that dissolved phosphate is also deposited when chemical reactions are going to take and convert it, or in other words, change it into insoluble, meaning non-soluble, can't kind of dissolve forms that precipitate into the sediments. So again, why is phosphorus important? Well, phosphorus is critical for the structure of nucleic acids, which is what makes up DNA, right? And also for phospholipids. And those phospholipids, as we'll learn later in the semester, are really important because they make up our cell membranes. So in animals, we also see that phosphorus is very critical for bones and teeth. And phosphorus can be added to an ecosystem by the weathering of rocks or through human activities, because we as humans can actually add any type of nutrient to the ecosystem. And sometimes, as we've learned with carbon dioxide, and we'll talk more about climate change in our next lecture, we can really wreak havoc on things by adding too much of a nutrient. So again, here's kind of the marine example of this. You have the phosphate, becomes dissolved phosphate that's going to be taken up by your primary producers, which are then eaten by consumers. They will dissolve, they'll go into the sediment. You also see the detritus and the dissolved organic matter going into the sediment, and then you have rivers bringing in more phosphate, and you just keep cycling throughout the ecosystem. Over here is an example from the book. I won't go too much into that because, again, you do have that description in your book. But as I said, you can actually add phosphate via weathering and erosion. You can also add it via fertilizer, which is a big problem. Plants are going to take up that phosphate. Plants are then eaten by the animals. Then we have the decomposition of that, and it goes back into the plants, and we start all over again. We just talked about how the nutrients of carbon, phosphorus, and nitrogen are continually recycled throughout ecosystems, right? Unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on how you look at it, the flow of energy is a little bit different. We don't have that nice recycling process with energy. What we see with energy in an ecosystem is that energy flows in a one-way path, and it goes from the bottom of your food chain, your producers, up to your consumers. The reason why I said unfortunately it flows in a one-way path is that in this one-way path we lose a lot of the energy. So on average about 10%, sometimes it's 5%, sometimes it can be up to 20%, but we say about 10% of the energy is transferred from one level up to the next level of the food chain. And we term this the pyramid of energy. So this pyramid of energy right here. And the energy pyramid represents each trophic level by a volume directly proportional to the energy that is stored in the new tissues per unit time. So these energy pyramids will never be inverted, meaning you'll never see a narrow base and a broad top, just because of the laws of thermodynamics, where energy cannot be created or destroyed. So we're always starting with the most energy down here. Only 10% makes it to the next level, 10% makes it to the level after that. So in this example from the ocean, you see the phytoplankton on the bottom. This is 10 million calories. We go up to krill, so 10% of that makes it. That would be 1 million. And then we go up to a baleen whale, which only 10% of that makes that, so that is 100,000 calories. That kind of should help you realize why we don't see a whole lot of top consumers in ecosystems, right? Because that energy, you lose less and less of it as you go up, so you have to eat that much more to get the energy that you need. So it really wouldn't be sustainable to have a lot of top or tertiary consumers in an ecosystem. Over here, you see an example from the prairie. You have your producer down here. This is 100%. 90% of that's going to be lost due to metabolism, heat, and waste between each of the trophic levels. So you go up here, you only have 10% of that left for that primary consumer, such as the herbivore, which is a prairie dog in this case. And then only 1% of that is going to go up to the secondary consumer that is going to eat the prairie dog. So you can see how that energy is lost, 10% makes it up each level. Bison help to influence the food availability in ecosystems. So they can actually increase prairie dog populations because prairie dogs function better when they are living in grazed grass. And then those prairie dogs in turn are going to provide food for small mammals, amphibians, and reptiles, which are in turn good food for snakes and birds. So you can see, again, if we just take out those bison, you're not only affecting your ecosystem from the picture that we looked at in terms of a keystone species, but you're also affecting it in terms of the amount of energy. Because if you decrease this food source of the prairie dogs, because the bison aren't there to graze the grass, that's going to decrease the amount of food for the next trophic level up. So again, bison are very important for the prairie ecosystem. The last type of ecosystem cycling that we're going to look at is water cycling. And water, as you know, is essential, right? It's essential to all biomes, which are what we're about to talk about. Fresh water on the land is going to flow to the ocean, and then it seeps into the underground aquifers. Water then re-enters the atmosphere via evaporation, and then it falls back to land via precipitation. So when we look at the American prairie, what we see is that in the Midwest, there is the Ogallala aquifer, so underground water there, and that supplies many crops in the Midwest. If aquifers like that aren't replenished, they're going to eventually run out, right? Which can be a problem. You've probably heard some issues with the water table here in Hawaii, right? That's where we're getting our drinking water from. And if we have, with sea level rise coming up, if that starts to seep into the underground water source, then we could get some issues, right? Some that we've had a little bit in the past as well. Areas such as the APR can actually help aquifers recharge because they do not require the use of water. So whereas a lot of these ranchers that might be irrigating crops because they're also farmers, that takes up some of the water, but APR, where you just have bison roaming, they are not going to be using water. So fresh water is a very valuable resource, as I'm sure you're already aware of, but I think that we as humans really take it for granted sometimes that we can just turn on a faucet and fresh water comes out. So in addition to water's role of just keeping us hydrated, it does a lot of other things. So it irrigates crops, it sustains our fisheries, and it provides a lot of recreational opportunities. So although water is used, it's not used up. Again, it's ultimately going to be returned to the global ecosystem as it evaporates to the atmosphere, it flows into the rivers and streams and ocean, or enters underground aquifers. Okay, so now it's time to move into learning objective number 3, where we are going to learn all about biomes. Biomes are large areas that are defined by characteristic plant life. The characteristic vegetation or plant life is in turn going to be determined by patterns of temperature and rainfall because that's going to affect plant growth, right? And the temperature and rainfall is going to vary depending on the intensity of sunlight and how that sunlight hits different parts of the earth. So you can see in this figure here, you've probably Seen this back in elementary school, even high school, where you have your globe, you have your sun is hitting the earth directly at the equator, right? The sun hits the earth at a little bit of an angle everywhere else, right? So because the sun hits the equator directly, you're going to see your tropical climate, right? They have the highest temperature because they're closest to the equator. They also tend to have high rainfall. Your temperate climates have moderate temperatures because they're kind of in between. And then at the poles, you're going to see very cold climates there. So each biome is going to be characterized by typical ranges of temperature and moisture. We also have terrestrial or land biomes versus aquatic biomes, right? Because we know a large portion, over 70% of our globe is covered in water. For the terrestrial or land biomes, the plant life is going to be driven by patterns of temperature, rainfall, and seasons. Whereas when we look at aquatic biomes, the life is driven more so by temperature, salinity, which is the saltiness or the amount of salt in that water, the depth of the ocean, and also the movement in terms of the ocean currents. In this map, you see the most common biomes, at least the terrestrial biomes here. 6 of them are considered to be very well known, very common. Those 6 are your tropical rainforest, your desert in yellow here, your temperate grassland in brown, the temperate forest in green, the taiga in blue, and the tundra in purple. There are also 2 other biomes shown here that are not quite as common. One of those is the savanna, which is in orange, and the Mediterranean, which is in this reddish color. So we're going to look more at the definitions in terms of what determines these biomes in the next slide. So looking a little more here at the different types of biomes. First of all, have our tundra. This is going to be up here in the Arctic region. It also occurs in high elevation mountainous regions. You have very low growing vegetation, and there tends to be kind of a layer of permafrost soil. In other words, it is frozen all year long, and it's very close to the surface of the soil. Then we have our taiga, which is our evergreen trees right here. There are very long and cold winters and only very short summers. So kind of think Alaska for your taiga. Then you have temperate, and we kind of divide temperate a little bit into temperate grassland and temperate deciduous forest. So the deciduous forest, so these are going to be trees that lose their leaves, right? They are going to drop their leaves in the wintertime and then regrow them in the spring. And generally in this temperate forest area, you have moderate winters and moderate rainfall. In the temperate grassland, there tends to be perennial grasses and other non-woody plants. In North America, we think of the prairies. So what we've been focusing on this whole chapter, the North American prairie, that is an example of a temperate grassland. The Mediterranean, as I mentioned, isn't quite as common, but this is going to be long, hot, and dry summers and cool, damp winters. You have short evergreen trees and shrubs with kind of leathery leaves that are going to be found here. We then have our tropical forest. This is going to have very warm temperatures and sufficient rainfall to support trees. You often have really tall trees that form the top of that canopy, and you can have both deciduous or evergreen trees in your tropical forests. Then we have the savanna, which also is not as common of a biome. This has very warm temperatures. It has 2 seasons, either dry or rainy. The primary vegetation is grasses with some shrubs and rare trees. Then we have the desert, which we all know is extreme dryness, right? There are cold deserts that have cold winters and hot summers, and then there are hot deserts that are just uniformly hot all year round. Temperature really doesn't change. You probably heard before that the Big Island of Hawaii has all of these different ecosystems, and it's true. You can find pretty much all of these different types of biomes in small amounts, various fashions on the Big Island, which is really cool. So these are our terrestrial biomes. We also have our aquatic ones. We can have aquatic marine biomes. This covers about 3/4 of the earth, right? So 75% includes oceans, coral reefs, estuaries. And estuaries are just that region where your rivers are coming in and emptying into the ocean. Then you have aquatic, freshwater biomes as well. So they're going to have a low salt concentration. This is going to be your ponds, your lakes, your streams, rivers, etc. I wanted to end this lecture kind of going back to what we began talking about with the bison. So I have the question here for you: should bison be conserved? So back in 2005, the APR introduced 16 bison, including several pregnant females, to the area in Montana, and the herd has now grown. And the APR continues to buy more land, but what happens on the other end of that is that means less land being available to cattle ranchers. So from everything that we talked about in this lecture, the answer to this question about bison being conserved, it should seem like an obvious answer, right? That we should conserve the bison because they're ecosystem engineers, they're key species. They help to add to the amount of energy available in an ecosystem. They play a role in nutrient cycling, but there's always another side to the story. And that's what we see a lot with conservation, is that there's always conflicts, and a lot of times they're economic conflicts. So the conflict that it really exists in this case is the conflict between ranchers and the APR. Because the ranchers depend on the land for their livelihoods, right? And they're concerned about the presence of bison nearby because, one, that's taking up ranch land, that's taking up land that could be used to grow crops. And they're also worried that by having those bison so close to their herds of cattle, that all the predators like grizzly bears that like to prey on the bison, that those predators are in turn going to get their cattle as well and affect their livelihood. The APR has tried to mitigate or try to resolve some of these conflicts. One thing they did is they created this program where ranchers actually get compensated for not, plowing the fields or changing the grassland in their plot of land that they have their cattle ranging on. And so then when they go to sell their cattle, they get compensated for keeping their land wildlife friendly. But even with this, effort, there's still a lot of conflict that exists, and like I said, that's so common in conservation biology, whether you're talking the American prairie or whether you're talking the marine realm, whether you're talking freshwater. So there's always seems to be, two sides to every coin, right? And one isn't wrong, the other isn't wrong. It's just tension exists there, and you have to work out a compromise, which is what's going to have to happen somehow in this case. That is all for this lecture on Chapter 22. I tried really hard to keep this lecture a little shorter, so hopefully it was a little bit shorter and took you a little less time to get through. You only have one achieve assignment besides reading. So of course, read Chapter 22 or at least skim it in the e-text, and then complete Chapter 22 adaptive quiz. And I'd really appreciate any feedback from you all. If you want to email me and say, hey, I liked the format better the first week where you had a homework and a regular quiz. Or you can email me and say, I really like the adaptive quiz. So just go ahead and give me some feedback like that so I know which form of using Achieve seems to help you more, because you are paying obviously to use Achieve, so I want it to be a valuable resource for you. So if you have an opinion one way or the other, feel free to email me and let me know your thoughts on the homework versus quizzes versus those adaptive quizzes. That's all I have for today. Mahalo for watching.